He was never meant to enter the most forbidden rooms beneath the Vatican. But now, after decades of silence, he's ready to share what the Church tried to keep buried. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. This story has crossed oceans of time. I'd love to know where it finds you tonight. Beneath Rome's heart, there is a place beneath the heart of Rome where silence is older than stone and deeper than prayer. It does not echo, because echoes require permission to return, and this place gives none. You won't find signs or plaques. It lies beneath centuries of basilicas, under sunlit piazzas, and the blood-soaked layers of empire and faith. It waits in the dark, behind unmarked corridors and thick iron gates that swallow sound. Few have stood there. Fewer still remember it. I was never meant to be one of them. Not a scholar, not a priest, just a custodia caretaker. I swept floors, polished hinges, refilled lamps, a shadow among pillars, invisible even to the monsignors I bowed to. But in the Church, invisibility becomes a cloak. Eventually, no one sees you at all, and when no one sees you, doors open. One was sealed with 3 locks, one brass, one iron, one blackened by soot. I found it by accidenta, so I believed. A priest had dozed off, keys clinking as he snored. I should have walked away. Instead, I listened to something older than obedience. The hall beyond smelled of nothing. The air felt still, as if it too had been warned. The stone here didn't breathe. The deeper I went, the more I knew. This was not a tomb. It was a boundary. The Vatican archives are not a library. Not even truly an archive. They are memory in containment. A secret, not untold, but unspeakable. That night, I touched history with trembling hand parchments like dried skin, ink that whispered, not declared. Names history erased. Documents never dusted, never dared. Next morning, I swept. I polished. I remained unseen. But I knew the Vatican is not what it shows. It is something else, a heart buried so deep, it no longer needs to beat to be alive. Behind the iron doors, the first time I passed through all 3 doors, I remember the sound, or rather, the absence of it. Metal on metal, once, and then stillness. No echo, no hum, just the breath of silence. The first lock was modern, the kind you'd see on a bank vault. The second was older hand forged, its key long and twisted like a forgotten prayer. The third was ancient, blackened iron, rusted at the corners, but still cold, untouched by sunlight. That door creaked, not from age, but resistance. It didn't want to open. Beyond it, a hallway. Narrow, uneven, lit by flickering lamps that glowed more out of memory than purpose. The air was thick, not quite dust, not incense. Something else. Time, maybe. The passage curved, as though truth could not be found in straight lines. At each turn, retreat seemed possible but never happened. Once inside, your footsteps stopped belonging to you. There are rituals. Not sung or recited, but rituals still. Drawers sealed in wax. Shelves numbered by an ancient system modern scholars rarely decipher. The wax wasn't just to close, but to bind. Red for restricted, gold for diplomatic, white for pontifical, and black. I saw it only once, on a drawer deep in a vaulted room, no label, just a black seal, and beneath it, no light Tangari, do not touch. Even silence has rank. There's reverence and there's warning. Some silences rest on your shoulders, others press against your lungs. Not fear awareness, a sense that the walls remember. I was only the custode logging requests, guarding what must not leave, sweeping up where time grew thickest. But slowly, I began to see a name out of place, a seal that shouldn't be broken. I knew which drawers whispered. Then something changed. Not in the archives. In me, I stopped being invisible, not to the scholars or cardinals they never looked, but to the place itself. The doors ceased resisting. The drawers no longer flinched. It was as if I'd been accepted, not as a threat, but as a witness. I had crossed more than iron. I was no longer preserving memory. I was becoming part of it. When the oil lamp burns, there were nights when the Vatican fell asleep. Not like Rome, which never truly sleeps, but in a deeper, more deliberate silence. A quiet that settled over the archives like a velvet shroud. The scholars had gone home. The guards paced their routes. And somewhere in a side corridor, an oil lamp flickered behind a half-closed door, casting long shadows against the stone. Those were the nights I wandered. Not far. Never far. Just far enough. I told myself it was part of the job of final check to ensure no parchment was left exposed to the night air. But in truth, I was chasing something, or being pulled. In the stillness, the archives seemed to expand, like lungs drawing in a breath held for centuries. Corners emerged I hadn't noticed during the day. Hallways tilted where stone had shifted with time. A drawer left half open not carelessly, but because it had swollen with age and wouldn't shut. In one of those drawers, I found something not in the catalogue. No seal, no reference. Just a linen-bound folder, frayed and yellowed. Inside, 4 handwritten pages. No heading, no signature. Ink blurred by time and moisture. The language was Italian old, with spellings long obsolete. A confession from a monastery in the Alps. A child had claimed visions of fire in the sky and voices in 3 tongues. The church dismissed it. The document was never filed, just hidden. I placed it back, but I didn't forget. The more I explored, the more I found them. Pages without name or record, some fragile, others pristine, as if waiting. A sketch of a cathedral that does not exist. A letter from a bishop pleading that a doctrine be struck. Not for lack of faith, he wrote, but because the people will begin to lie to themselves in the name of God. These weren't scandals. They carried not lies, but truths no one would accept. That was when I understood. The archive does not only preserve what the church once remembered, it holds what it cannot forget. These were not forgotten drawers. They were scars. Each night I wandered, I felt the whisper of something deeper than doctrine. A presence not divine, but utterly human. Some truths do not emerge because they are hidden. Some remain hidden because they are unbearable. Before my eyes grow dim, The years have a strange way of folding themselves into silence. You don't notice at first, not when the hands still move with precision, when the eyes still catch the faintest script on a crumbling page, not when the oil lamps burn steadily, casting amber light across the faces of saints and the margins of forgotten letters. But one day, your reflection in a brass drawer handle looks older than the nameplates it holds. And you know time has entered with you. My hands now tremble when they touch parchment. The lines I once read with ease now blur. Even the dust, once a companion, clings more heavily to my lungs. And still, I return, because something in me refuses to let these pages fall into silence. I do not come to accuse. I am not here to expose or condemn. I am here only to speak, softly, as one who has seen too much to remain still. There is a moment in every life when silence becomes heavier than words, when you wonder not what secrets should be told, but what truths can be borne. I've spent decades walking between shelves that never end, beneath ceilings so low you bow instinctively. I have opened folders not meant to be opened, read letters never meant to be seen again, touched the faded wax of seals broken long ago, and each time I felt the weight of something sacred. There are documents I will never name not out of fear, but out of reverence. One page in a drawer of diplomatic memos described an exchange between two popes, decades apart, united by the same doubt. Not a lack of faith, but a terror that their certainty was incomplete. One line remains etched in my mind. Truth is not the light we carry. It is the fire we cannot touch. The greatest danger is not lies. It is truths that arrive too soon. Some of what I've read would not destroy faith. It would deepen it. But institutions do not thrive on complexity. They survive on clarity on creeds and repetition. And so, certain truths are not denied. They are simply set aside, held in quiet rooms until the world is ready, or until no one remains to speak them. I am not a prophet. I was a man with a broom and a watchful eye, slowly turned witness. I cannot offer proof. I offer only this: memory and the knowledge that beneath every polished surface lies something more tender, something unfinished, something trembling to be heard, not to shake the church, but to remind us that even here, the deepest truths still wait in the quiet. And as my sight fades and my steps slow, I know I must speak not to illuminate, but to share the silence that shaped me, before my eyes grow too dim to see, and the last of what I remember is buried with me. Eyes that theology dared not face. There is a room buried deep within the Vatican's walls, so plain at first glance it could be mistaken for storage. But it is not. Its name appears on no map, no visitor log. The key is separate. You must ask for it by name. And even then, you're met only with a look, a silent question. Do you truly want to see what lies beyond? I discovered it late in life, almost by accident, or perhaps the archives chose to reveal it. It was called the Deposito Pittorico Riservatore, Reserved Painting Repository. Inside, walls of racks held canvases stacked like forgotten files. No plaques, no lighting, just shadow, dust, and oil. Some bore no signature. Others had names deliberately scraped away, and as I moved through them, I felt it. These were not forgotten works. These were hidden ones. One piece still haunts me, a charcoal study, perhaps Michelangelo's, a figure draped loosely, curled in grief not shame. The eyes looked not to heaven, but to nowhere, as if the search for God had become unbearable. No light surrounded it, no divine hand, just sorrow. Beneath, a note in soft script: non destinato per la cappella troppo umano. Not destined for the chapel too human. Too human. That phrase echoed in me for days. These paintings hadn't been silenced for heresy, but for honesty. They didn't offer redemption or divine assurance. They depicted pain that simply was. Faces not asking for salvation, only enduring. These works were dangerous not because they defied belief, but because they asked us to look at the parts of faith we fear. The silence, the doubt, the moments when prayer feels like breath into a void. Another painting showed the crucifixion not from below, but from the side. Mary collapsed, John shouting, Christ's eyes wide with terror. Not peace, no angels, no glow, just sky and blood. It wasn't sacrilege, it was something rowere a man, not a saviour, in the moment of his abandonment. Why were they never shown? Perhaps because they prompt not reverence, but reflection. They don't affirm what we wish faith to be. They reveal what it sometimes becomes: a hand reaching out, finding nothing. These works weren't rejected. They were preserved quietly, carefully, in a place where truth can breathe without shame. And there among them, I felt it not God's absence, but sanctified doubt. The kind that doesn't ask if God exists, but wonders if He too sometimes weeps. Letters never sent. There is a drawer in the Vatican archives with no official name, only a label in fading ink, barely legible now. It reads, Lettere non inviate, letters never sent. It rests quietly among diplomatic files and theological decrees, nestled so discreetly it might never be noticed unless you already knew where to look. I found it one evening while searching for something else entirely. That is often how the archives speak, not in answers, but in detours. Inside were bundles, carefully bound in red cord. Each envelope bore the same crest, each page written in the same elegant hand. Some were drafts, others final copies, but none bore a seal. None were ever delivered. These were not official writings of pontiffs, no encyclicals or proclamations read to the faithful. These were words that never left the Vatican. Words too vulnerable, too uncertain, too human. One letter was addressed to the leaders of Europe, dated late 1917 in the heart of the First World War. The handwriting was Pope Benedict XV's. He pleaded not with authority, but anguish. He asked for a ceasefire not for politics, but for the sake of the human soul. If peace does not return soon, we shall have no churches to pray in, and no hearts left to pray. In the margin, a cardinal had written, "No one will listen, and if they do, your holiness will seem weak." The letter was never sent. Another draft, in a simpler hand, came from Pope Pius XI. It was meant for Germany, warning against the rise of fascism. It named names, questioned loyalties. But at the bottom, a note: risk of retaliation too high. Wait. So the church waited. And while it waited, the world darkened. These are not documents of scandal, but of hesitation. Moments when Pope-supposed vessels of divine certainty paused, when they considered saying what was true, but didn't, not for lack of conviction, but fear of consequence. And in that silence, we see something rare: the man behind the robes. One letter was not addressed to a leader, but to God. It bore no date or salutation. It began, "I do not know if I have done enough." The ink near the bottom was smudged. Perhaps the writer's hand trembled. Perhaps he wept. The handwriting matched that of Pope John Paul II during the abuse crisis. The letter read more like confession than prayer from a man burdened by failures he could not mend. We are taught the Pope is infallible when speaking ex cathedra. But the archives hold another truth between declarations and silences. These letters were not discarded. They were preserved, not for doctrine but memory, as if even the Church knew. Unsent words are part of the story too, and perhaps, in their silence, they speak loudest of all. Archivum secretum. Most people hear Vatican secret archives and imagine something out of a novel, a vault of forbidden relics, ancient conspiracies, hidden truths buried under centuries of dust and locked doors. But the truth is quieter, stranger, and more human. The real name, carved into stone and sealed with papal authority, is Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the private apostolic archive of the Vatican. Secretum does not mean secret in the modern sense. In Latin, it means private, reserved. The archives do not belong to the Church, the College of Cardinals, or bishops scattered across continents. They belong to one man, the Pope. Whoever he is, wherever he sits, the contents of these shelves are his alone. He inherits not just the keys to the city-state, but the burden of memory, locked in kilometers of shelves that stretch beyond comprehension. That is the paradox. The most private archive in the world, owned by a single man, inside the most public religious institution on earth. A place where leaders kneel in front of cameras while, behind the scenes, truths too raw for ceremony sleep under wax and thread. The archive lies at the crossroads of spiritual power and temporal restraint. What is preserved here has shaped the world, but it is held in silence, under one voice. Some call that control. Others, stewardship. I once asked an elderly priest who'd worked in the archive for 40 years why it remained closed to the world. He smiled and said, "Because some truths need a witness, not an audience." That answer stayed with me. Everything here is personal. That is its power and its fragility. A papal letter to a king is not a public recorded, is a whisper meant for one ear. A memorandum on a heresy trial is not a historical exhibit, it is a moral wound still waiting for closure. These documents were never meant for the world, yet they hold its turning points: treaties, betrayals, revelations, regrets. Some remain sealed, marked ad oculos pontificis tantum, for the Pope's eyes only, unread for decades, even centuries. What does it mean for a document to wait, untouched, while the world outside transforms? It means history waits. It means privacy is not always silence, but preparation. There is something sacred in that. Not because secrecy is holy, but because discretion, when wielded with reverence, becomes an act of mercy. Not everything must be revealed at once. Not every truth is ready to be heard. Here, memory endures, and when the world is ready, the door will open. Not before. 85 kilometers of memory. The first time someone told me the archive stretched 85 kilometers, I didn't believe them. Not because it seemed too large, but because it seemed impossible to measure something that doesn't obey ordinary space. 85 kilometers of memory, they said. 85 kilometers of handwritten pleas, of ink still drying centuries after the hand that wrote it turned to dust. But this place doesn't measure itself in distance. It measures in weight, the kind that sits in the lungs, like incense or unspoken truth. The corridors stretch without ensign brightly lit, most dim, lit by cold bulbs or desk lamps left burning too long. There are rooms locked before the first telephone rang in Rome, drawers unopened since popes wore red shoes and rode in sedan chairs. No matter how far I walked, I never reached the edge. I'm not sure one exists. The archive holds over 35,000 volumes. Some catalogued, others not. Some open to scholars, most sealed not by fear, but by discretion. A decision that too much knowledge, too soon, might fracture understanding. This is no conspiracy-only caution. 60 to 80 scholars gain access yearly. They apply months in advance. Even then, entry is not guaranteed. It's an invitation. You must ask for something specific. You may see only what relates to that, and you're never left alone with the past. No documents leave, no photos, no scans. You read in silence, among others who know they are not just studying history, they're listening to it breathe. Some doors remain locked. Some truths wait not for discovery, but for readiness. The Vatican does not hoard. It shelters. It waits for the right reader at the right time. Until then, 85 kilometers of memory rest beneath Rome, not forgotten, just waiting. Galileo's trial. The name Galileo echoes through the halls of the Vatican archives like a whisper that refuses to die. Not because it is spoken often, but because it was silenced too long. His story is known, in pieces. The man who dared to look through a telescope and say aloud what the heavens had already been shouting. The earth was not the center. The universe did not turn for us. But here, in the stillness of the archives, the story feels different. Less like legend, more like a wound. His trial is preserved in parchment and ink, not myth. The original documents sit quietly in a box with soft red trim, pages worn thin by centuries of fingersome trembling with anger, others with regret. The records include transcripts of interrogations, rebuttals, and the 1,633 sentence, Galileo Galilei was vehemently suspected of heresy. Not for what he discovered, but for what he would not fully recant. He was made to kneel, to deny, to whisper that he had been wrong. He wasn't. But truth, even when it travels like starlight, can take centuries to arrive. The public never sees the margins, notes in softer hands, from clergy who doubted even as they obeyed. One page bears the pause of a pen before copying the verdict. Another, marked interno for internal ice contains a bishop's words. His theory is not ungodly. Only our fear of it is. Fear not of science, but of losing the scaffolding of belief. If earth could move, what else might shift? Doctrine? Authority? The soul? The conflict was never truly between Galileo and the Church. It was within the Church. A struggle not of fact, but of comfort. And preservation won, yet the Vatican did not destroy his work. They stored it, filed it, even kept Galileo's 1,613 letter, pleading that his discoveries did not contradict Scripture, but revealed its deeper purpose to show not how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven. For centuries, the Church said nothing. Then in 1,992,359 years after the trial, Pope John Paul II acknowledged the error. He called it a tragic mutual incomprehension, a phrase avoiding blame, but not denying pain. I once held a printed copy of that speech, filed beside the trial records. Tucked with it, a note from an archivist. This is not an apology. It is a beginning, and maybe that's all the archive can offer. Not closure, not vindication, but beginnings wrapped in the slow unraveling of certainty. Galileo saw truth the world wasn't ready to hear. The Church, by preserving his defiance, let that truth endure. Not spoken, not shouted, but safe. 10. Templar's resurrection. For centuries, the story was simple. The Knights Templar warrior monks, cloaked in red crossishad, fallen from grace. Accused of heresy and idolatry, they were branded enemies of the Church, burned at the stake, their wealth seized, their name buried beneath suspicion. It was said the Church condemned them with the crown of France, that faith itself declared them unworthy. But in the stillness of the Vatican archives, behind coded labels and dry Latin, lay a truth that unraveled the legend with the soft rustle of parchment. It is called the Pergamentum Chinon, a document so fragile that touching it feels like brushing time itself. Discovered in 2001 by Italian paleographer Barbara Frail, it had rested in darkness for centuries, misfiled, perhaps, or hidden. What it revealed rewrote a chapter the world thought was closed. Dated August 1308, the parchment records a secret inquiry in the castle of Chinon, where envoys of Pope Clement V interviewed Templar leaders. It is not myth. It is the Pope's absolution, clear and sealed. The Church forgave the Templars, not because they were guiltless, but because their faults were superstition, not heresy, not enough to sever them from the Church. Yet that forgiveness was never spoken. Why? Because absolution could not erase politics. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars money. He feared their influence. He needed their fall. If the Pope had declared their innocence, he risked a schism, so the absolution was silenced, and the flames rose. I remember reading the Chinon parchment for the first time. My fingers trembled not from disbelief, but from the weight of it. There it was, the Pope's signature, genuine, a document that, had it surfaced in its time, could have changed the fate of thousands. Instead, it waited in the dark. In its silence, the Church preserved both justice and injustice. The Templars were not excommunicated, but neither were they defended. They became martyrs, not of faith, but of silence. When the parchment came to light, it did not accuse. It simply existed proof that history is not always written by victors. Sometimes it is archived by the cautious. Beneath the heart of Rome, absolution was quietly signed, then quietly forgotten. And in that silence, centuries echoed. Between cross and swastika, there is a box deep within the archives, marked not by a title, but by a code 3 letters, 2 digits, and a faded red seal. Its contents were long speculated about, whispered in scholarly circles, but never revealed. For decades, historians questioned what the Vatican knew during the rise of Nazi Germany. They debated in essays, editorials, classrooms, and courts. But inside this box, the answers arrive not as declarations but as fragments, letters, telegrams, diaries, notes passed in shadow. Each one offers a glimpse into a time when the Church walked a path so narrow that even silence became a choice. The correspondence began before the world grasped what Germany would become. In the early 1930s, the Vatican was already communicating with the Third Reich. Officially, the talks concerned religious freedom and protecting Catholic institutions in a state where power was solidifying like frost on glass. The 1933 Reich Concordat aimed to guarantee the Church's independence. But it was a tense, contractone side promising order, the other hoping it wasn't surrender. The documents do not lie, they worry. Letters from bishops to the Holy See describe rising anti-Semitism, dismantled youth groups, shrinking church influence. One cardinal wrote, "We are given protection in words and persecution in actions." And still, Rome waited. Why didn't the Church speak louder, sooner? That question haunts the margins of every page. Some believed diplomacy would protect the faithful. Others feared that confrontation would shatter the German Church. A few hoped silence would by Timur save lives. It didn't, but silence was not absence. In one brittle folder, I found a 1941 report from a monastery near Krakow. The monk's name has faded, but his words remain. He described night trains, people packed like cargo, their names whispered in fear. At the bottom he scrawled, "We may not speak, but God sees all." A copy was sent to Rome. No reply is recorded, but the letter was kept preserved, not discarded. Elsewhere in the box are coded requests for help. From priests sheltering Jews, nuns forging baptismal certificates, bishops who defied orders and were watched. These were not pulpit protests. They were quiet resistances done in candlelight, behind doors, without praise. Yet some absences sting. Reports read and filed but unanswered. Appeals from Jewish leaders acknowledged but not acted upon. Warnings returned to folders, as if bearing witness were enough. The archive does not explain or excuse, it preserves. And in that preservation, it asks the question still echoing: when facing evil, is silence a strategy or complicity? The Vatican never ceased praying, but in the box marked only by code, prayer is written in ink stained by doubt, the Pope of the Shadows. When the Vatican announced it would open the archives of Pope Pius XII, the world held its breath. For decades, his name stood between reverence and accusation, praised by some as a diplomat, condemned by others as the Pope who watched the Holocaust in silence. His papacy, from 1939 to 1958, overlapped with one of history's darkest chapters. And for years, the doors to that chapter remained locked. Until 2020. I was there when the files were unsealed. The mood wasn't triumphant or scandalous, it was quiet, like the moment before confession. Boxes arrived, bound in tape so old it cracked. Each folder bore his seal. Each page, his signature, or those acting under him, and one truth became clear. This was not a man of inaction, but of relentless calculation. The archive holds thousands of letters, bishops pleading for intervention, diplomats urging caution, Jewish families asking help for their children. Some received replies, some met silence. The line between mercy and hesitation blurred. One 1942 letter from a Hungarian bishop described over 1,000 Jews being expelled. He begged the Vatican to speak. The reply, 6 lines in Italian, "We share in the sorrow, but at this moment, prayer is the most powerful weapon we possess. Not denial, not indifference, but not rescue either." Most haunting was a list 44 Jewish names, sheltered in a Roman convent, dated the 10th of October, 1943, days after Nazi raids began. Only 12 survived. No margins, no notes, just name-sand silence. But the archive also tells another story. Secret diplomacy, letters in veiled language, forged baptismal certificates, Vatican orders to hide children under Catholic identities. The Church did act quietly, often successfully, but always without voice. Pius XII chose diplomacy over denunciation, fearing public condemnation might provoke Nazi reprisals or close secret channels of aid, and perhaps he was right. Still, holding those papers, it's impossible to know if his silence saved more than it endangered. Some call him the Pope of Shadows, working in silence, saving what he could. Others say his caution cost lives. The archive offers no verdict, only fragments of a voice restrained, formal, burdened. But perhaps it reveals this: the weight of moral leadership in an age of horror is a burden no man carries without trembling. And what remains most visible in Pius XII's legacy may not be cowardice or complicity, but a soul navigating fire, hands bound by fear of what might burn if touched too boldly, relics of empire. When war arrives, it does not always knock down doors with gunfire. Sometimes it wears silk gloves and speaks in treaties. Sometimes it moves with the quiet precision of men in uniforms cataloguing history as if it were merchandise. In the early 19th century, as Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, they did not just conquer cities, they entered sanctuaries. They came not for prayers, but for possession. The Vatican, with its walls and centuries of guarded faith, was not immune. It had survived sieges, reformations, revolutions, but what came with Napoleon was different. It was not an attack on the body of the Church, it was a stripping of its soul. In the archives, a series of brittle letters exchanged between Vatican officials and French representatives reveals the unraveling. The language is formal, even courteous. But beneath it lies quiet devastation. One letter from 1809 pleads for the return of 37 crates filled with manuscripts, ancient codices, chalices, and bones believed to belong to saints. The French reply is brief. The items are being preserved for civilization, a justification dressed as generosity. They took what mattered most not only in gold, but in memory. Illuminated texts copied by monks who had never seen beyond their cloisters. Reliquaries kept in candlelit chapels. The jawbone of a martyr. These were not objects to the church. They were relics, fragments of eternity. But to an empire of reason and revolution, they were spoils. I once found a manifest listing a single shipment. 97 volumes, 16 reliquaries, 5 crucifixes, one fragment labeled Lignum Crucis wood of the cross. The handwriting trembles. It ends with one word, speditoshipt. The archives do not dramatize. They record. When Napoleon fell, some items were returned. Many were not. The Vatican pleaded, negotiated, bartered. Entire collections vanished. Some ended in museums, others in private hands. Some were simply lost. One letter, written by Pope Pius VII after his return from exile, describes seeing the empty shelves. It is as though the breath of the church has been taken, he writes. No outrage, just loss. He compares the looting not to theft, but to dismemberment, as if the church had been dismantled and scattered across Europe. And in a sense, it had. These documents are not in grand reading rooms. They sit in a quiet corner, folded into diplomatic files. But if you trace the ink with your fingers, you can almost feel the hum beneath the parchment, the sorrow of a faith boxed and carried over the Alps, not as gospel, but as trophy. Not every relic was taken by fire. Some were taken by paperwork, and the scars still breathe in the silence of empty drawers. The Pope and the Shogun. There is a drawer in the eastern wing of the archives with no title, only a date 1611 and a faintly etched chrysanthemum. Inside, folded between layers of parchment, lies something few expect in the Vatican. A letter written in elegant Chinese characters, signed not by a bishop or European monarch, but by a shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu. A name rarely mentioned in papal history. Yet here, deep beneath Rome, his words rest quietly. The letter is brief, direct, without ornament. In translation, we do not accept a faith that divides families, but we respect the knowledge and loyalty your men bring. It was not delivered by diplomats, but by merchants hidden inside a hollow wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, sealed in wax. Christianity was already banned in Japan. Missionaries preached in whispers. Churches were destroyed. Believers forced underground. To follow Christ meant risking not just exile, but execution. And yet, amidst this danger, letters passed between the Vatican and the shogunate openly, not often, but deliberately. A thin thread of dialogue woven through silence. The archives hold several of these exchanges. Most are copies, translated by Portuguese Jesuits. Their script is measured, cautious, margins filled with notes in Latin, Too bold, soften tone. Avoid confrontation. These were not sermons, but negotiations designed to preserve contact, not assert doctrine. One letter from 1620 avoids theology entirely. It speaks of trade, language schools, shared values. It ends with a line underlined twice. It is better to plant seeds than to count converts. A quiet departure from missionary zeal, it shows a Vatican not expecting Japan to kneel, but simply to listen. After 1624, the letters stop. No explanation. Perhaps the routes closed. Perhaps the messengers vanished. Or perhaps silence, at last, prevailed. Yet the letters remain filed not under conquest or evangelization, but in a drawer labeled Missione Oriente, the Eastern Mission. There's something deeply human in these pages. Not triumph, not loss, just an effort between two distant worlds, so speak, to understand. Beneath every robe and every kimono, people reaching across the void. These were not letters of power. They were gestures of peace. And though centuries have passed, while borders shifted and empires fell, here beneath St. Peter's, over the voice of a shogun still linger synced in grace, preserved in silence. Dioceses that disappeared. There are shelves in the archives filled with names no longer spoken, not because they were erased, but because the world around them vanished, cities swallowed by sand, valleys lost to time, mountaintops once crowned by stone altars, now bare and windswept. These are the dioceses that disappeared. Once sacred jurisdictions, governed by bishops in robes and rings, now existing only in ink and memory. Their records sit in quiet stacks, catalogued with care, though their cities have long since fallen into ruin or legend. One folder, dated to the early 12th century, describes the Diocese of Salona, a once thriving Roman coastal town in what is now Croatia. It holds inventories of chalices, baptismal records, letters to Rome, even sketches of its cathedral, but Salona was broken by invasions and earthquakes. Today, it's little more than scattered stones. Yet in the archives, its faith remains. Masses still echo faintly in parchment, but none haunt quite like Montségur. The name appears only rarely in official Vatican records, and always obliquely, a region, not a seat, a troubled territory during the 13th century. There's no declaration of a diocese, yet there are fragments pointing to a secret ecclesial structure active during the Cathar persecution. Not Catholic as Rome understood it, but strangely familiar. Prayers rewritten, rituals mirrored, belief inverted, yet preserved. Montségur's end is well known: the siege, the fires, the silence. But the archives offer something else. Map, undated but marked 1244, drawn in faint ink on brittle parchment. It shows a winding path away from the fortress, not toward towns, but into the Pyrenees. Beside it, a note: Exitus in nocte absque flamma. Escape in the night, without fire. Another file lists dozens of names, each marked with a single word: Eversite-scaped. If true, it means some did not die in the flames. They walked away, unseen, down paths too narrow for horses, too steep for armies. There are no follow-up reports, just silence. But silence in the archives is not absence. its invitation. Those names forgotten by cities, erased from memory, still exist in these pages. Not martyrs, not heretics, just voices once carried on the wind. It's strange to think of dioceses vanishing. We imagine the church as permanent stone, gold, continuity. But faith, like memory, fades. It is buried by politics, toppled by conquest, erased by time. And yet, in the shelves beneath Rome, they endure. A letter here, a seal there. A bishop who wrote only once before his church turned to dust. They are gone from maps, gone from sermons, but they are not lost. Not while someone still opens these pages, still reads their names aloud in the silence. Blueprint of the past. There's a drawer in the architectural wing of the archives that doesn't belong to any particular section. It rests beneath grand basilica designs, beside records of restorations and renovations. It holds no masterpieces, no domes by Michelangelo, no frescoed chapels. What it contains is quieter, drawings of buildings that never quite came into being did, briefly, only to vanish before the mortar dried. I found it by accident while searching for old plans of the Lateran. The folder was thinner than the rest, its paper crinkled and smelling faintly of chalk. Inside were sketches, margins filled with corrections and indecipherable shorthand. No artist's name, no commission, just thin black lines on yellowed sheets. The first page showed a monastery nestled against a cliff. Abbazia di Pietra del Vento, Abbey of the Windstone. I had never heard of it. No record exists in diocesan registries. No papal blessing marks its founding. Yet the drawing was exact cloisters oriented to the morning light. A library built into the hill, stone channels to catch rain in silence. This wasn't fantasy. It was memory. Other pages followed. An octagonal chapel atop a mountain pass, said to sing with the wind. A sanctuary on an island no longer found on maps. A cathedral reduced to its footprint, no bell tower, no nave designed, as one note said, for the faithful who do not wish to be seen. Some drawings were incomplete, half a floor plan, a shadow of an altar that may never have stood. But each line was careful. Not grand, not ambitious, something gentler reverence maybe, or longing. These weren't designs for patrons, they were messages from the past, hoping to be found. I brought one to an archivist, older than the paper itself. He looked at it for a long time and said, "These were the monasteries built when faith had no permission, only courage. Some," he said, "were built in times of exile or plague. Others by breakaway monks, unsanctioned and unseen, who lived by prayer and necessity, not by Rome's approval. Most didn't last, washed away by storms, reclaimed by earth, absorbed back into official structures. But the blueprints were saved quietly, no fanfare, no commentary, just kept. In these plans, there are no saints, no miracles, only foundations and thresholds. But they speak as clearly as Scripture. They remind us, faith is not always a monument. Sometimes it's a single room carved into stone, facing east, where someone once knelt and called it holy. Ink is a strange preservative. it holds shapes that no longer exist, spaces we can't enter. But here, in the archives, these sanctuaries live again not in grandeur, but in line and curve. Quiet testimonies from a time when prayer needed no permission, only shelter. The nation within Rome. Before 1929, the Vatican was a paradox. It sat at the heart of Rome, yet belonged to no one. No longer ruler of the Papal States, and not yet sovereign in its own right. It was a city without a country, a throne without a crown. The Pope lived as a prisoner in the Apostolic Palaceno by chains, but by choice, refusing to recognize the authority of the new Italian state. For nearly 60 years, the Vatican existed in silence. A spiritual empire behind stone walls, its voice loud in prayer, but hushed in politics. And yet, even in isolation, the Vatican moved. The archives from this era do not shout. They murmur, letters bound in twine, memoranda written with restraint. Not proclamations, but quiet negotiations, back channels beneath marble corridors. The world assumed the Church had turned inward, content to contemplate while Europe reshaped itself in smoke and steel. But isolation did not weaken the Vaticanate, refined its reach. In a drawer labeled Relazioni Estere, 1870, 1929, I found correspondences from unexpected places: Argentina, Japan, Ethiopia, ambassadors without titles, bishops as envoys, conversations carried in letters never meant for the press. A French diplomat in 1915 mentions unspoken understandings with the Austro-Hungarian Empire agreements never signed but always respected. One unsigned document from World War I outlines a plan for humanitarian aid to prisoners no allegiance, just camps in Poland, France, Serbia. The Vatican had no army, no flag in battle, but its influence traveled in sealed envelopes, crossing borders where weapons failed. Even in exile, the Vatican held quiet alliances with monarchs, with governments that valued spiritual endorsement, and with ordinary people who continued to kneel, unaware the Pope lived behind gates that were as political as they were spiritual. When the Lateran Treaty was signed in 1929, the Vatican was finally recognized as a sovereign state. The Pope was no longer a prisoner, but the years of silence had reshaped the Church's understanding of power not as dominion, but as influence. Quiet, global, enduring. The archives from that time are soft-spoken but steady. They show a Church learning to operate in shadows not out of deceit but necessity. It could no longer rule lands, so it learned to guide souls and policies with subtlety. The Vatican became a nation not by marching into history, but by waiting for the world to knock. And when it did, the Church was already listening. Vatican and Washington. In a narrow drawer labeled America Septentrionalis, tucked among routine reports and correspondence, lie messages never published or acknowledged notes written to US presidents. Not official diplomatic cables, but personal letters handwritten, sometimes typed, often unsigned. Messages from popes, secretaries of state, senior monsignors, all with one aim: to shape the moral architecture of a world emerging from war. The oldest of these date to the final years of World War II. One letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt speaks of a Europe that must not lose its soul in rebuilding its walls. The Vatican watched as lines were drawn, empires crumbled, and a colder world emerged. Peace was coming, but so was division. East and West. Faith and ideology. The Iron Curtain had yet to fall, but its shadow had begun to stretch. In a 1946 memorandum marked Confidentiale, the Vatican urged US leaders not to isolate Germany too harshly. The reasoning wasn't economicist, it was pastoral. Humiliation breeds desperation, and desperation forgets God, it warned. Punish too severely, and the defeated might abandon reconciliation for ideologies worse than the last. A 1950 letter to President Truman, likely never formally delivered, offered cautious support for the Marshall Plan as policy, but as mercy. It praised the effort to rebuild with dignity, insisting material aid must be paired with spiritual healing. Victory was not peace. A city could be rebuilt in stone, but not always in spirit. Other letters addressed displaced persons, shifting eastern borders, and the rising Soviet threat. One unsigned note, likely by a Vatican diplomat, pleaded for America to see the priest behind the Iron Curtain not as a relic, but the final voice of a silenced people. These were not policies. They were never public, but they show a Vatican engaged and quietly persuasive. With no army, no council seat, it held memory, presence, and the ear of those who knew moral authority can shape history as surely as power. In the silence of the archive, these pages still breathe. They speak of a church guiding without commanding, shaping without demanding. A church that understood the fates of souls and nations are never truly separate. And so it wrote. Softly, persistently, into the heart of power, from the stillness beneath Rome, smoke from Krakow, the letters came in waves. Some arrived folded inside prayer books, smuggled across borders by nuns disguised as aid workers. Others were sent under diplomatic cover, sealed in envelopes with false return addresses, marked in faint pencil with symbols only the recipient would understand. They came from Krakow, from Budapest, from the hills of Slovakia, and the flat, scorched plains of Ukraine, from bishops and priests who had stayed behind long after retreat would have been the safer course. Their words were not official. They were human. The archive calls them resoconti testimonialite testimonial reports. But they are not reports in the bureaucratic sense. They are cries. One letter from a Polish bishop in 1942 begins without salutation. They are burning the children first. Quicker, they say. It continues in a flat, exhausted hand, recounting the emptying of villages, the disappearance of entire congregations. There is no theology in it. Just detail, just smoke. These letters were sent to the Vatican throughout the Second World War. Dozens of them. Sometimes multiple from the same region, sent weeks apart, updating horrors that had no name yet. They spoke of forced labor, of churches being used as stables, of trains that left at dusk and never returned. The writers begged for guidance, for clarity. What could they say from the pulpit when the pews were now lined with soldiers? What was the moral course when survival itself had become a kind of sin? One cardinal from Hungary wrote, "If I stay silent, I preserve the church. If I speak, I preserve the truth. But either way, something dies." That line has never left me. Within the Vatican, these letters were read. Some were copied. Notes were written in the margins, some marked with urgency, others with hesitant Latin abbreviations that suggest the reader didn't know what to do. There were meetings quiet, unrecorded, where the Curia debated how far the Church could go without being silenced entirely. They weighed moral authority against strategic survival. A papal denunciation could have brought clarity, but also retaliation. It could have closed the only corridors left to help the hidden, the hunted. And so, instead of statements, there were actions. Secret baptisms issued for Jewish children. Vatican passports forged for fleeing clergy. Monasteries quietly opening their gates at night and pretending by day they had always been empty. But always the question remained, was this enough? The archive never answers that. It shows us the weight of choice, not its righteousness. It preserves the tension, the agony of bishops who had once written sermons now writing reports of slaughter, the exhaustion in a letter from Krakow, where the writer ends simply, "If no answer comes, I will continue to pray, but God feels very far away." The Vatican has often been judged for what it did not say. But here, in these letters, we see what it could not unsee. We hear the smoke before we see it. We feel the heat without touching the flame. And perhaps, in these pages, we do not find resolution. We find only reflection. A record of men who stood in the breach between survival and truth, unsure which direction led to salvation, but walking anyway, quietly. Through ash, the speech never delivered. There is a folder in the archives, unlike the others. It contains no stamps, no signatures, no final seals, just a series of drafts, each one typed on the same yellowing paper, each with the same heading: Allocutio Pontificia non pronunciata. Papal address, not delivered. The date at the top is 1999. The location, Jerusalem. The contents, a speech never spoken. It was meant to be historic. A formal acknowledgement of the Church's failures during the Holocaust. Not just sorrow for the suffering, but a clear admission that silence had cost lives, that hesitation had consequences. The trip itself went forward. Pope John Paul II stood at the Western Wall. He placed a written prayer between its ancient stones. He bowed his head, and the world watched as he expressed regret in gesture, in presence, in tone. But the speech, the one with words shaped over months, weighed by theologians and historians, was pulled at the last moment. The drafts reveal why. The earliest version is bold. It speaks of institutional failure, not just human weakness. It names Pius XII. It refers directly to missed moments of intervention. One line reads, "We did not do enough when the light of God's image was being extinguished in millions." That version is heavily marked in red. In the margins, notes from advisors question the tone, too accusatory, reframe in pastoral language, risk of theological imbalance. Each subsequent draft is softened. The language becomes more general. Church is replaced with some within the Church. Complicity becomes lack of courage. A paragraph referencing specific events in Poland is crossed out entirely. The final version, still undelivered, speaks of a sorrowful chapter, and the tragedy of inaction, but it no longer places the Church at the center. It mourns, but it does not confess. The reasons are many. The Vatican was walking a tightrope. On one side, the moral urgency to acknowledge history without evasion. On the other, the fear of unraveling an already fragile institutional memory. There were concerns over doctrinal precedent. What does it mean for an infallible institution to admit fault, not of individuals, but of its own past choices? There was concern over the reaction of those within the Church who still saw Pius XII as a protector in silence, not a failure in voice. One handwritten note, likely from a senior advisor, reads, "Regret is not the same as guilt. Let us not confuse tone with confession." And so the speech was never delivered. Its existence was never formally acknowledged. It remains filed quietly, as if waiting for a time when the Church no longer fears what it already knows. And yet, the very act of preserving the drafts off, not destroying them, says something. The Church did not bury this moment. It recorded it, not as triumph, but as hesitation, as an almost. The archives are full of things spoken too late, or not at all. But this speech, sitting quietly among them, might be the most honest of all, because in its silence, we hear the tremble, the weight of knowing what should have been said, and the burden of still waiting to say it. Michelangelo's other creation. There is a folder in the Vatican archives that bears no artist's name, though every line inside it speaks unmistakably of one man. The paper is old, but the strokes are alive, deliberate, sculptural, filled with tension. These are not preparatory drawings for the Sistine Chapel or St. Peter's Dome. They are something else, intimate, unsettling, human in a way that almost defies reverence. The label on the folder is simple: Studi non esposti, studies not exhibited. They are sketches Michelangelo never showed publicly, not because they were unfinished, but because they revealed something that the Church of his time, perhaps even he himself, was not prepared to name. A male figure, unclothed, not idealized but vulnerable, his hand resting not in gesture but in weight, his eyes not lifted toward heaven but closed, as if turning inward. The pose is almost too personal, a body caught not in ecstasy or martyrdom, but in something wordless rest, maybe, or resignation. Another page shows a tangle of limbs, arms, and torsos, sketched over one another like echoes. There's no narrative here, no biblical reference, just bodies and presence. These drawings were not censored in the traditional sense. No decree was issued, no inquisitor called. But they were not welcomed either. A faint note, scrawled in Latin on one page by an unknown reviewer, likely a church official, reads, "Formae nimis terrenae." The forms are too earthly. And that, perhaps, was the problem. Michelangelo had a way of bringing the divine down into muscle and skin. His David was already a scandal for its naked confidence. But these sketches go further. They offer no lesson, no redemption. They simply exist in their own truth. And sometimes, truth without explanation can be the most dangerous kind. The Church did not destroy them. It preserved them. Quietly, bound in folders, kept far from the tourists who stare up at the painted vaults and whisper awe. These pages were never placed beneath glass. They were never given plaques, but they were kept. I asked once why. An older archivist, long past the age of pretense, simply said, "Because even when we're not ready for beauty, beauty remains ready for us." These sketches show a Michelangelo searching, not decorating walls or pleasing patrons, but asking something deeper. What is the line between holiness and desire, between the sacred and the seen? They are not erotic, they are not profane, but they unsettle because they do not flinch from the complexity of being both flesh and spirit. In one final drawing, buried at the back of the folder, a figure kneels not in prayer, but exhaustion. The face is unfinished. The body is complete. One hand reaches out, not upward, but forward, as though trying to touch something just beyond the edge of the page. There is no note on this one, no judgment, only the quiet space of paper left open, as if even Michelangelo didn't know what came next. And that is where the archive leaves him. Not in triumph, not in masterpiece, but in that unfinished space between vision and restraint where beauty, too honest to display, is instead entrusted to silence. The gospel that ended in fear, in the deep recesses of the Vatican library, near where sacred texts are handled with gloves and reverence rather than curiosity, there rests a book older than most nations. The Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Bible, sits quietly under low light. Its pages are precise, almost impersonal in their perfection Greek uncials, etched in even rhythm across vellum, undistracted by ornamentation. It is a monument of devotion, but within its sacred uniformity, there is a fracture. The Gospel of Mark ends suddenly. No resurrection, no appearances, no final charge to the disciples, just a tomb, just fear. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That is the last line. For centuries, this abrupt ending puzzled scholars, troubled preachers, and unnerved theologians. Later versions of the Gospel, added to manuscripts over the years, included a longer ending verses that spoke of Christ's return, his words to the disciples, the triumphant closing needed to match the other Gospels. But not here, not in the Codex Vaticanus. In one of the most revered and ancient Bibles in existence, the final word is silence. The archives hold copies of early church debates about this ending. Scrolls and letters from bishops who found it difficult to preach a gospel that did not conclude with victory. Some wondered aloud whether the copyist had simply run out of space. Others thought the final leaf had been lost. But the spacing at the end of Mark in the Codex suggests otherwise. There is no room for more. No sign of a missing page, just a clean, deliberate stop. One margin note, written centuries later in a cautious Latin hand, speculates, perhaps it was meant this way, perhaps the fear was the point. That phrase was never copied into sermons. It was never cited in catechisms, but it echoes through the archive nonetheless. Next to the official texts are the apocryphal ones Gospels that never made it into the canon. Some poetic, others strange, a few unsettling. The Gospel of Thomas, speaking in riddles. The Gospel of Mary, calm and sorrowful. And even stranger fragments. Accounts of Jesus as a boy, sculpting birds from clay, breathing life into them. Tales too human, too mysterious, too distant from the careful theology that shaped orthodoxy. The Church preserved these texts too, though quietly, not to endorse them, but perhaps because even what was rejected still mattered. And yet, none of those apocryphal endings hold the stark power of Mark's silence. Because this wasn't a gospel excluded, it was a gospel included, left broken, fear, not faith, as the final note. Why? That question lingers. Maybe the early church wanted to show the realism of doubt. Maybe Mark's gospel ended in fear because the earliest believers lived inside it. Maybe the empty tomb and the paralyzed silence of those who found it was truer than any triumph. Or perhaps it was a test for us, not them to finish the story ourselves. The Vatican never rewrote it. It preserved the rupture. It preserved the fear. And in doing so, it reminds us that sometimes the holiest words are not the ones that reassure us, but the ones that leave us still waiting, the council of unfinished thoughts. There's a strange energy around the documents of the Second Vatican Council, less like the faded solemnity of ancient decrees, more like the lingering static of voices still arguing in the room after everyone has left. The archive holds every draft, every amendment, every footnote scrawled in the margins by men who understood that what they were doing would either split the church or save it. For some, both. The council, called by Pope John XXIII in 1962, was not meant to resolve old heresies. It was not a reaction to war or crisis. It was an invitation to examine the mirror, to ask not what the church had become, but what it might yet be. And in that invitation came tensioned centuries of doctrine placed in conversation with a world that no longer recognized the language it spoke. In one folder, heavy with annotations, you find early debates on the liturgy, whether Latin should remain the universal tongue of worship, or whether the church should open its ears to the languages of the people. One cardinal from Northern Europe wrote, "Christ did not speak Latin at the table." A note next to it in another hand simply says, "But Latin listens without changing." They were not debating grammar. They were debating identity, whether prayer should feel eternal or familiar, and whether it could be both. Then came the discussion of women, not just their role in the church, but their absence in decision-making. One proposal suggested the inclusion of female observers in council sessions. It was accepted, but only as observers. Their voices were present, but not heard in vote or vote count. Yet, in the margins of those discussions, notes appear in soft, steady script. Why do we fear their presence? Why is silence safer than conversation? No answer follows, only more notes. And power. Always, inevitably, power. The council sought to shift the church away from the rigid centrality of Rome and toward the shared responsibility of bishops worldwide. Collegiality, they called it. A beautiful word with sharp edges. Some feared it would fracture unity. Others saw in it a renewal of the early church's communiona body, with many voices, not one voice many times. The debate stretched across continents, with American bishops writing of democratic principles, and Eastern patriarchs warning against fragmentation masked as freedom. What's remarkable is how much of the council remains unresolved. It produced documents brilliant, challenging poetic ones. Lumen Gentium, Gaudium et Spes, Dei Verbum. But these texts often raise more questions than they settle. They open paths without pointing to destinations. They are full of pauses, of phrases like "it must be further discerned," or in the spirit of ongoing renewal. The Council did not define new dogmas. It asked for listening, and listening, in a tradition trained to speak with authority, can feel like hesitation. Some say the Council changed everything. Others say it changed nothing. But in the archives, you see something quieter. The pages of men caught between reverence and risk. You see arguments that never reached the floor, and ideas that never made it to parchment. You see what was not said. And in that absence, you hear the Church still thinking, still unfinished, still asking. The Pope's private tears. There are rooms in the archives that feel less like history and more like breath, not because of what they hold, but because of how they hold it. The documents stored there aren't declarations or encyclicals. They aren't council decrees or theological verdicts. They're journals, drafts, letters never sent. The handwriting is uneven, personal, occasionally smudged. And for a moment, as you read them, the voice that emerges isn't that of a pontiff. It's simply a man. One folder belongs to Pope Paul VI. Inside is a single sheet, folded into thirds, the ink faded, the language intimate. It is not addressed to anyone, not even God. Just thoughts. On it, he writes, "There are days when I wonder if I have betrayed silence by speaking too much, or betrayed the people by not speaking enough." No signature, no title, just that sentence, hovering between confession and prayer. Nearby is a letter written by Pope John Paul I Albino Luciani, who served only 33 days before his sudden death. The letter is to Christ. It begins with a familiar formality, as if it were a homily, but halfway through it changes. He writes, "If you are calling me home soon, let me leave without fear. I wanted to be a shepherd, not a symbol." The handwriting trails off, as if even he was unsure whether the words were allowed. He was not asking for immortality. He was asking to be understood. There are other documents, less composed, more raw. Pope John Paul VIII, often seen as the unshakable figurehead, kept notebooks filled with questions. Real questions, not rhetorical ones. One reads, "How do I carry the suffering of millions when I cannot answer the suffering of one?" Another page, from the early 1980s, is marked only with one phrase, repeated 4 times. "Do they still believe me? Not believe in me. Believe me." These are not doubts of faith, they are doubts of self. The kind that come when divine appointment presses down on human shoulders. When a man who once whispered prayers in a small parish becomes the voice through which billions hear God. The archives preserve these writings not as contradictions, but as reminders that even the ones we see crowned in white, guarded by stone and tradition, still ask the same quiet questions at night. One final entry, undated but clearly recent, lies tucked behind a devotional. It's in the hand of Pope Benedict XVI. He writes, "The Church must teach, yes, but first, it must listen. The wound of the world is not ignorance, it is loneliness." Then, beneath it, he adds a single line, smaller, "I, too, have felt it." That line doesn't make it into sermons. It doesn't stand in St. Peter's Square, but it lives here, between paper and candlelight, where the office of Peter gives way to the soul of the man who wears it. And perhaps that's the holiest space of all, not infallibility, not doctrine, but the moment when even a pope puts down the mask of certainty and lets himself be known by his tear snot in public, but in the one place no one was ever meant to look. Until now, trials without judges. The pages are thin, too thin for what they contain. Folded in plain folders, marked only with dates and initials, they sit in a part of the archives no guidebook will ever point to. These are not doctrinal writings. They are not relics of ancient empires or lost rituals. They are case files, letters, reports, confessions, accounts written in halting prose by those who were expected to obey and by those who were supposed to protect. Some names are redacted, others are not. Some dates are missing, others appear too often. It begins with a letter, always a letter, from a parent, a parishioner, a priest. The tone is almost apologetic, as if asking whether the pain is too great a burden to place into writing. The accusations vary in detail, but not in shape. A child, a priest, a silence that followed. Then another letter. Then another. The Vatican received them all. In the archives, you find them categorized not under theology or law, but reserved or reserved. For decades, these reports were handled quietly, internally. Sometimes they resulted in transfers, sometimes in letters of reprimand, sometimes nothing at all. A bishop writes, "The matter has been resolved pastorally," but the next file shows it was not. Another report from another town. Same priest, different child, the same silence, disguised as procedure. These were trials without judges. Investigations that rarely reached outside ecclesial walls. Not because no one knew, but because knowing came with consequences, legal, moral, spiritual. And so the Church, the institution that preaches light, often chose shadow. Not from malice, always, but from fear. Fear of scandal. Fear of weakening the flock. Fear of acknowledging how much harm could come from the hands once raised in blessing. Some of the documents are heartbreakingly candid. A priest admits to years of abuse. He begs not for forgiveness, but for relocation. One letter from the 1970s states plainly, "He has shown repentance. Let us offer him the chance to serve elsewhere." Elsewhere. As if pain were local. As if a new congregation would be less wounded than the last. But silence is not neutral. It does not simply postpone reckoning. It shapes it. It multiplies it. And here in these pages, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The shielding was not occasional. It was systemic. It was rationalized, papered over with phrases like canonical discipline or pastoral discretion, words that dulled the edge of truth. Yet even within the silence, there are exceptions. A few voices who wrote what others would not. A cardinal who insisted, "We do not protect the Church by hiding its wounds. We protect it by cleaning them, no matter how deep they go." His letter is filed among many that ignored him. The archives hold all of it. The failures, the concealments, the unbearable cost of choosing institution over innocence. And though the Church has begun to speak, to change, to act there, in this quiet corner of the archive, the past has already spoken. It is not shouting, it never did, but it cannot be unheard. Sacred real estate. There is a cabinet in the archives built not of wood or metal, but of paper centuries layered upon one another, pressed tight in legal Latin and monastic shorthand. At first glance, its contents look dry. Deeds, contracts, property assessments, seals and wax, signatures from bishops, abbots, and long-dead notaries. But if you know how to read them, these papers do not just describe land, they describe power. The Church owns more property than most nations. Cathedrals and shrines. Yes, but also farmland, apartment buildings, hotels, banks. And this didn't happen overnight. The archive shows how the accumulation unfolded, not through conquest, but through inheritance, donation, legal maneuvering, and at times, a quiet kind of persuasion. A widow in Tuscany giving her vineyard to a monastery to ensure her husband's soul would be remembered in prayer. A French duke, absolved of guilt on his deathbed, gifting 2 villages and the surrounding forest. A pact between a distant pope and a king in exile, trading sanctuary for sovereignty. Each deed tells a story. Some stretch back to the 11th century. The ink faded, but still legible. The language is exact, the theology baked into the clauses. Land was not simply space. It was salvation. To give to the Church was to carve a path toward heaven, and once given, it rarely returned. But not every transaction was holy. Some are laced with quiet threats, subtle lines that suggest leverage. A monastery acquiring land from a noble family on the brink of scandal. A bishop offering absolution in exchange for legal control of a bridge. And with each transfer, Rome's reach expanded not by sword, but by parchment. The conflicts came later. Kingdoms falling, new governments rising, revolutionaries storming estates with torch and decree. In the archives are records of church lands seized by Napoleonic edicts, then returned by cautious compromise decades later. There are transcripts from Vatican lawyers fighting legal battles in Italian courts over properties claimed by Mussolini's regime. One case lasted 43 years, the Church arguing not from sentiment, but from title and unbroken chain of ownership, stretching back to a monk who planted olive trees before the First Crusade. And through it all, the Church kept the documents. Every transaction, every boundary shift, every failed appeal, and every victorious clause. There's something almost forensic about it. The divine and the bureaucratic fused together in ledger ink. But it's not just about land, it's about presence. A chapel in a forgotten village, a guest house on a street now lined with neon signs. These are footprints, proof that the Church existed there, prayed there, mediated life and death there. And by keeping the records, the Vatican doesn't just protect its holdings, it preserves memory. One parchment, brittle and cracking at the edges, outlines the original deed to a plot of land outside Avignon. The last line reads, "For as long as God wills this ground to be held for His glory." But the next file shows a court challenge filed in the 1980s by the local municipality, claiming the land had reverted to public use. The Church fought it. quietly, successfully. In the archives, you see the pattern: faith translated into real estate, prayer rooted in soil, and beneath the liturgies and the creeds, a very human concern to remain, not just in hearts and minds, but on maps, because holiness, for all its mystery, has always needed an address. Intelligence and ink of silence. There is a folder in the archives with no insignia, no papal crest, no ecclesiastical seal, just a numb 30,645 reals and a stamp that simply says non destinato alla stampa, not for publication. Inside are cables, fragments of notes, and briefings typed on translucent onion skin paper, their corners brittle with age. They do not discuss doctrine or faith. They speak instead in the language of shadows, covert meetings, unnamed couriers, neutral territories. Here, the Church is not only the keeper of souls, it is the quiet broker between powers that rarely admit they speak at all. The Vatican, officially, has no intelligence agency, no encrypted satellites, no field agents with false passports. But it has something else. It has reach. Every city, every village, every regime, even the most closed as a priest, a parish, a presence. And in places where embassies are blocked and diplomats watched, the Church remains, preaching, listening, reporting back not as spies, but as shepherds, and sometimes in their listening they hear what no one else can. The documents in that folder are careful not to name names, but the initials appear: CIA, Mossad, MI6, SISMI. Vatican briefings passed along with the language of suggestion rather than evidence. There is concern in Krakow. The bishop in Prague has received visitors at unusual hours. A shipment from North Africa arrived with no manifest. These are not confessions. They are pulses, taken by a body that has spent 2,000 years learning how to read a room before anyone speaks. One letter, dated 1963, describes a meeting between a Vatican diplomat and an American operative in Zurich. The topic was not faith, it was Cuba. The Church had information whispers from missionaries, confessions made in fear, patterns noticed in shipping ports. The Vatican offered what it could, not as an act of politics, but of prevention. The note ends with a line that feels less like espionage and more like exhaustion. Let no more young men die in a war of ideologies. The trust was mutual but measured. Intelligence agencies knew the Church could access places they could not. The Church knew the cost of being too visible. So the relationships remained unspoken, conducted in chapels, behind altars, under the guise of pastoral concern. A conversation between a priest and a foreign agent might begin with scripture, but end with coordinates. Even Mossad, famously insular, made quiet contact, particularly in the wake of the Holocaust, when Nazi fugitives disappeared into the haze of post-war Europe. Some were traced through church channels, baptismal certificates that did not match, parish relocations that raised questions. The Vatican never declared itself a hunting partner, but in some cases, it did not stand in the way. These ties were never uniform. They depended on the Pope, the Secretary of State, the mood of the world. But what remains consistent is the tone of the documents. Not bold, not self-congratulatory, just firm, watchful, often sad. In a handwritten margin of one such memo, Some unlikely a Monsignor with diplomatic clearances crawled, "The shepherd must walk even where the wolves wait, if the sheep are already there." And so the Vatican walked, without flag or anthem, just silence, ink, and a memory long enough to hold secrets most governments forget. Not espionage. Not exactly. Something older, something harder to name. Rituals for the end of the world. There is a volume in the archives that is rarely touched, bound in dark leather and locked behind a panel not marked on the public inventory. Its title is not printed on the spine. You must already know what to ask for. When opened, the air around it shifts quiet, becomes stillness. Its contents are not prophecy, but preparation. It is a manual, a ritual guide, not for feast days or sacraments, but for endings. Not individual death, but the death of something larger. It is called Ritus Ultimus Ecclesiae, the final rite of the Church. It is not dated, but scholars believe it was compiled sometime in the 1940s, when the Vatican faced the unthinkable possibility of German occupation. There had already been whispers if Rome were to fall, if St. Peter's were